building on the 6th floor, room N674. I'm Professor Manita Pavel, and I'm happy to embark on this journey with you. Today we are going to learn Chapter 1, Evolution, the themes of biology and scientific inquiry. So let's analyze the title. The main concepts that we need to know would be evolution, what is biology, and scientific inquiry. So what then is biology? Biology is derived from two terms, bio, which is life, and logos is the Greek word derived from logi, which means study of. So to put into perspective, biology is the study of all living organisms and their interaction with the environment. What is the environment composed of? The environment is composed of both living factors and non-living factors, or non-living components and living components. Who makes up the non-living components would be air, water, carbon dioxide, atmosphere, buildings, your laptops. Anything that does not have life, which is non-living, would be the non-living abiotic factors. A comes from the word without, biotic is life, non-living. And the living factors, also called scientifically as biotic factors, would be any living organism, human beings being the most complex, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, etc. I have incorporated a video slide, which I encourage you to go through, on the different signs of life. And this would be the mushrooms of the toadstool, which is fungi, fish. These are all the non-living organisms. You have plants, you have bacteria, you have a protist, and you have Euglena and amoeba out here. Now, there are 5 unifying themes in biology, which also represent the characteristics of living organisms. And the way living organisms are ordered is according to their organization, the information that we possess, energy and matter, the interactions that take place on Earth, and a key concept called evolution. So we're going to go through each of these unifying themes, and slide number 5 indicates here what I would put under a subtitle called characteristics of living organisms, some properties of life or characteristics of living organisms. So there are 7 characteristics of living organisms, namely order. Now, from the first illustration, this is a sunflower. Why is it showing order? What is the order with respect to the sunflower? You have larger petals on the outside, and on the inside, these little structures are also referred to as florets, which are smaller petals, florets. So look at the arrangement. You have larger on the outside, and then you have, becomes smaller and smaller. And the arrangements of the innermost petals of florets are in the form of a disc circle. So we refer to these as disc florets. This is all extra knowledge. Me being a plant biologist has studied this at a higher level. And we refer to it as ray florets and disc florets. It's good to just hear these terms, but in particular, I am not going to enforce these terms or ask these terms of ray florets or disc florets in the exam. This is just extra knowledge. So the order is the organization. All living organisms, including us, have a specific order. And that order would be always built from simple to complex. We will be dwelling on order a little later when I talk of hierarchical organization, how human beings or most living organisms are organized in terms of the order of complexity, building from simple to complex. So let's look now at evolutionary adaptation. The moment you hear these are two key terms, evolution and adaptation. This is a seahorse. And why are they showing us the illustration of a seahorse is because the seahorse has adapted itself. It has certain traits that other organisms do not possess in order to survive today. And so we come to the first term, evolution. I want to bring your attention to the next slide when we talk evolution. I'm sure many of you can identify the scientist or biologist. He is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is called the father of evolution. Important concept. You could be asked this in the exam. And Charles Darwin, he published his book in the year 1859. What is the name of the book he published? It was called The Origin of Species, which was based on his theory of natural selection, which we'll talk about in detail, the concept of natural selection. So when you hear the term evolution, the way I want you to remember is always make a related association with the terminology and concepts. So when you think what is evolution then? Evolution comes from the term to evolve. To evolve is to change. So evolution is the process of change over time. And in order for all living organisms to change over time, we need to adapt ourselves to this changing environment. If we are not able to change ourselves to the environment, to suit our environment, we will perish and become extinct. And the segue is, why do we see many organisms that lived in the different evolutionary periods like the Mesozoic era, etc., that are now extinct? Classic example is the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, but they are extinct today as they could not adapt themselves to the changing environment. And so they perished and died and became extinct. And so adaptation is a key feature for evolution. So coming back now to the slide on Darwinism, Darwin pointed out two main points. He says species showed evidence of descent with modification from common ancestors. Descent with modification means that we all have descended from a common ancestor, from an organism, another human species, Homo sapiens, that was previously present. But as we evolved, there were modifications or changes in terms of our unique traits in order to adapt and survive. So another key concept for evolution is adaptation and descent with modification, to reiterate the information. And the theory of natural selection. What is natural selection? It's a theory, it's a mechanism behind the descent with modification evidence. And Darwin explained the duality of unity and diversity. So we living organisms, we display, we show both unity and diversity. What do we mean by unity and diversity, or diversity is, although we share unity, we share common characteristics, yet we are different from one another because we have our own unique traits. We have our own individual DNA, which is the genetic code of life. Our blueprint is unique to each individual. And so the diversity of life, we talked of unity, the diversity of life is approximately, there are 1.8 million species that have been identified up to date. And every species is given a two naming system, what we call binomial nomenclature. By two. Nomial comes from the Latin derivative, which means naming. Classification is a system of identifying the organism. What is the two-part system or two naming system? The first term is called genus and the second is called species. So we see here human beings are referred to as Homo sapiens. Take note of the way we write the genus and the species. Homo is written in capital letters because that refers to the genus, and the species is always written in lowercase letters, which is sapiens. So we human beings are referred to as Homo sapiens. And there are estimated range over 10 to 100 million species present on the surface of Earth today. So all this had to do with the evolution, adaptation, etc. Let's come to the next illustration, characteristic number 3, which would be living organisms undergo regulation. So we can see the animal here. What is regulation? What are we trying to regulate? We have our external environment, we have our internal environment. What then is our internal environment composed of? It is composed of blood, body temperature, you have your bones, your tissues, your cells, etc., muscles. All that is our internal organization. So when you hear the term regulation, immediately we are referring to a complex, important term called homeostasis. What then is homeostasis? Homeostasis is the process of maintaining a steady, stable internal environment. What is this internal environment that we have to maintain constant? It is our body temperature, which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. But because we have this homeostatic mechanism, our bodies are able to fluctuate its body temperature by an increase of 1 degree Celsius or Fahrenheit or decrease of 1 degree Celsius or Fahrenheit. Still, homeostasis is being maintained. The key feature for homeostasis is maintaining the blood at a constant pH. And we'll go into details with this term called pH in the next chapter, Chemistry of Life. So you'll get a deeper understanding on the pH levels. And the pH of blood is 7.4. Take note of this number. However, the blood's pH should never fluctuate. That immediately will indicate that there is some infection or something going wrong in our internal organization. So to reiterate the main concept, homeostasis is with respect to body temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius, and blood, which is pH, has to be maintained at 7.4 to be normal. Let's go to the next key feature, the fourth characteristic of living organisms, energy processing. How is energy being used by living organisms? How is it being processed? So we see here the butterfly trying to suck the nectar or the pollen. And we see, I specialized in pollen biology. It's fascinating to see that different species of plants have different types of pollen grains. And so we define the term now energy. What is energy? Energy is the ability to perform work. All of us are performing activities. And during these activities, whether it's respiring, whether it's writing, whether it's speaking, whether it's digesting food, whether it's reproduction, whether it's an assimilation, all these activities require energy. And we're going to see how is this energy now being converted into different forms. So there are different types of in which energy is existing. Potential. Potential energy is referred to as stored energy. So my laptop has potential energy. My stand has potential energy. Anything around you that is stationary and is not moving possesses potential energy. Now I'm talking, so I'm using energy. That energy that is being put to work in motion, I'm writing, that is called kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is energy in motion. So potential energy is converted to kinetic energy. If I'm beginning to walk or exercise, the potential energy, stored energy now is being converted into kinetic energy. The moment the insect, the butterfly, is sucking the nectar, potential energy converted to kinetic and chemical energy because of the chemical reactions taking place in the plant. And a classic example when you think of plants, specifically green plants, is only green plants will undergo the process called photosynthesis. So during photosynthesis, the green plants, they contain a green pigment called chlorophyll, which is stored in the leaves of the plant. Solar or sunlight energy falls on the leaves of the plant. A chemical reaction takes place. So potential energy converted to sunlight energy converted to chemical energy during the chemical reaction. There is breaking of the bonds taking place. And these plants are manufacturing their food with the help of carbon dioxide and water. And what is released in the process is oxygen gas. So that is the energy processing that is occurring amongst living organisms. Characteristic number 5, growth and development. What is growth? We see a plant that has grown. So when you take a seed and you put it into the soil, you provide water, which is the nourishment for the seed to grow. Immediately, the seed has grown, it has developed from the seed into the stem, into the branches and the leaves. And so growth is an increase in the number and the size of cells. We human beings have gone through different stages of development. We are a zygote, which is the fertilized egg, which I'll discuss more in reproduction. We have now we are an infant. We go to teenage, we become teenagers, adolescent, adulthood, and then old age, which is called senility, and then end. So those are the different stages of development. Let's look at the 6 characteristics of living organisms called response to the environment. Unique carnivorous plant called is a unique carnivorous plant, called Venus flytrap. Now, what is so unique about a carnivorous plant? A carnivore is an organism that lives on the flesh of animals. Opposite of carnivore is herbivore, an organism that only lives on plants. And in addition, we have omnivores. I am an omnivore because I eat both plants and animals. So I eat both vegetables and animals. So I'm an omnivore, omnivore. So what happens to this Venus flytrap? We can see the prey, which is an insect. When the insect sits on the Venus flytrap, this Venus flytrap has small hair-like structures on the surface of the leaf. It senses the prey, and immediately it is going to release an enzyme that is going to digest the prey or the insect. And that's how this carnivorous plant is going to obtain the nutrients from its prey. Let's go to the 7th characteristic of living organisms, which is reproduction. In simple language, reproduction is to reproduce, to give rise, to perpetuate our own kind of species. I am a Homo sapien, so I will give rise to my own kind, which are human beings. I cannot give rise to a monkey or an ape or a frog or a cat. So reproduction is of 2 types, sexual reproduction, asexual. Sexual reproduction is the process of the union, the meeting of the haploid. Haploid means 1 set of chromosomes per cell, 1 N into parentheses. Haploid sperm cell with the haploid egg cell. So the sperm will swim to unite with the egg. Haploid plus haploid, 1N plus 1N results in 2N, which is called the diploid zygote. The zygote is the fertilized egg. The egg that we women produce is not fertilized by the sperm. So that zygote is now going to develop into the adult. So we were all once zygotes. Asexual. So where do we see sexual reproduction? In higher organisms, plants, some plants, animals, fungi, they will all reproduce sexually. Opposite of sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction. A in biology means without sex. So only one parent is involved in the reproductive process. The moment you think asexual reproduction, you must associate it with the most simplest organism called bacteria. So bacteria need only one parent, one sex, to reproduce. So they go through two processes called binary fission, conjugation. We don't want to dwell into both these processes. I'll only talk of binary fission. Bi comes from the word two, fission is splitting. So you have this one cell dividing into two cells, which each cell now is going to divide into two more. So from one you get two you get four, etc. And you will see that in the slides later. I will draw the images and put it into your folder. So our bodies, the cells in our bodies are also going through mitosis, which we'll discuss in the later chapters in the semester, which is asexual reproduction, namely mitotic cell division. So we finished with all the characteristics of living organisms, and we've come here now to the next topic, which is I've shown you a video on the seahorse, how it camouflages itself. So I encourage you to look at that. So we talked about life at different levels of organization. So we can study the hierarchy, the organization, how are all living organisms organized at different levels. And so we talk about now the biosphere, the level of organizations, ecosystems, communities, populations, organisms, organs, tissues, cells, molecules, and organelles. So to put this into perspective, I'd like you to go through the definitions in the textbook. When you read Campbell, please look at the definition of biosphere, ecosystem, community, population. I refer to this term called hierarchical organization. And I said hierarchy is a level of complexity. So you're building from simple. So if you look at our internal organization, we are composed of cells. A cell is the simplest or basic unit of life. The hierarchy which we are looking at. Cell is the basic unit of life that performs all activities. Cells are going to form tissues. Tissues are going to form organs. Organs are going to form organ systems, and organ systems are going to form the entire organism. And that's the level of organization that we see. However, we are going to look at plant animal cells. We are called eukaryotes, which I'll be defining in the next slide. And so we will have this term called organelles. We are also made up of atoms and molecules, which are the non-living components. But all these are the living components of the cell. And so we see here that cell theory states that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. And every cell is protected, enclosed by a membrane. What is the function of a cell? It is going to regulate, it allows the passage of small molecules to enter and exit. So what the cell requires, it will permit the molecules to enter in. What it does not require, excess of the molecules, of the ions, will be expelled or exit the cell. The cells of bacteria and archaea are prokaryotic. Prokaryotic means, pro comes from the word before, and eukaryotic means after. So, eu means true. Karyote is derived from the Greek word karyon, which means nucleus. So, before the nucleus was formed. So, a prokaryote is an organism that does not have a nucleus, does not contain a nucleus or other membrane bound or enclosed organelles. Organelles are little structures present within the cell. Example of prokaryote, the simplest organism is bacteria. Example of a eukaryote would be plants, animals, fungi, and protists. You'll be looking at all these organisms in the lab. Protists will include amoeba, paramecium, euglena. These are some of the protists that you will be seeing. So, we know the main two terms, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So let us look at a prokaryotic cell, bacteria. We'll go into details with prokaryote and eukaryotic cell structure and organelles in chapter 6, which is a tour of the cell. But just understand the main concept. They don't have a nucleus, but in order to be living, very important concept to remember. For any organism to be living, it must have DNA. And the DNA is in a specified compartment called the nucleoid region, which we will learn in a tour of the cell. Just remember, it's in a specialized compartment, separate compartment. And the DNA is a single circular loop. It's in the form of a loop, opposite to what we eukaryotic cells have. So let's look at a eukaryotic cell. This is the nucleus. It has a nucleus. It has all these little organelles or structures that are present within the cell. The nucleus, our nucleus has DNA, and our DNA is in the form of a double helix, which we will be seeing in the slides to come here. So, what surrounds this nucleus is called cytoplasm. Cyto is derived from the term cell. Plasm means fluid. And within this jelly-like fluid, you see all little structures called organelles are present, membrane-bound organelles. So that's the difference between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell. And we come now into what then is our genetic information? How is this genetic information transmitted or passed on? It's always passed on from parent to offspring, for generation to generation. So within our cells, we have structures called chromosomes that are present. And these chromosomes contain our genetic information called DNA. What does DNA stand for? Deoxyribonucleic acid. Remember this term, important. Basic concepts in biology. You need it for the whole semester. And therefore, this chromosome, which contains one long DNA molecule, has hundreds of thousands of genes. On a chromosome, there are hundreds of thousands of genes present. So, chromosomes have genes. And what then is a gene? A gene is a unit of hereditary information that is passed on or transmitted from parent to offspring for generation to generation. And these genes that encode our DNA are going to direct what type of protein would be made or how would the organism develop. So I've left another PowerPoint slide with a video clipping on DNA. I encourage you to go through it. This is just to reiterate information that we talked about in hierarchical organization. You have the egg cell. When the egg and sperm, this is the sperm, this is sexual reproduction. Sperm swims to meet the egg. It unites with the egg. It fertilizes the egg, which is called the zygote. The zygote develops, which is the embryo cells, which contain both copies of DNA, both from the sperm cell and the egg cell. And then you have the baby that develops, which is the offspring from both the parents. So the molecular structure of DNA accounts for its ability to store information. And each DNA molecule, our DNA molecule, is in the form of a double helix. It has these two long chains that are wound around each other. So if you cross your hands, this is the double helix. And each chain is made up of building blocks called nucleotides. There are 4 nucleotides, A, T, C, and G. So we see here now the double helix. This is what our DNA looks like, a double helix. And we have on each strand of the helix, there are these nucleotides A, T, C, G. So we see here now the concept of gene expression. What is gene expression? How are genes expressing themselves? It is the process of converting the information from the gene to the cellular product. Because genes encode for a particular protein. They contain the information to determine the type of protein that is being made and our development. An organism's genome is the whole pool, P-O-O-L, or library of genetic instructions. Therefore, genomics is the study of the whole set of genes, your whole pool of genes in one or more species, or it is the study of the set of proteins. So let's go to the next slide now. We're just showing you an illustration of how genes can be expressed. We talked of energy transformation and how energy is transformed into matter, but we are introducing you to 2 terms: producers, who are the producers, who are the consumers. Green plants are producers because they manufacture their food, and consumers are dependent on other plants and animals to obtain their food. So when organisms use energy to perform work, some of that energy is lost to the environment. All the unused energy is lost to the environment in the form of heat. And that energy is flowing through the ecosystem. It enters as light, exits as heat. which is then recycled. So we can see here how energy flow is taking place. So light energy comes from the sun. Plants are going to take in the chemicals from the soil and the air. They release it into the environment. Some of that sunlight energy is converted to chemical energy. Organisms use that chemical energy to perform work. All the unused energy is released to the ecosystem in the form of heat. And here they show you decomposers. The decomposers are fungi who are obtaining their food by breaking down large molecules to small ones. And then they return these chemicals to the soil. So we see there is constant interaction between us and the environment. And humans are interacting daily. As a result, sometimes there are dire consequences. Humans have greatly increased the burning of fossil fuels. And when you burn fossil fuels, what is being released is carbon dioxide gas into the environment, which is polluting the environment. And as a result, today we are faced with catastrophic events like tornadoes, floods, fire. This is resulting in the environment being heated, and we are faced with global warming, which is just one aspect of climate change. So we all need to try to prevent ourselves with eliminating unused energy to heat up the environment. So we come to all those 10 to 100 million species are divided into three main broad domains or categories by biologists who classified these species. They are called taxonomists. So taxonomists are biologists who classify organisms. So they classify them into three main categories called domains, which were bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The prokaryotes, the organisms like bacteria, which did not have a nucleus or membrane-enclosed organelles, would include both the domains bacteria and archaea. And the third domain were the eukaryotes, belonging to eukarya. And they were the plants, the fungi, animals, and protists. So plants produce their own food through photosynthesis. Fungi, they observe like the mushrooms. They obtain their food by breaking down the large complex molecules, animals ingesting their food, and protists, the most single-celled organisms, which were the diverse eukaryotes, amoeba, paramecium, euglena, all these are protists. So to put into perspective, we can see the bacteria, the archaea bacteria, different species of the bacteria. We looked at plantae, kingdom, which are plants, fungi, the kingdom and the organism is the same term, fungi, it's plural. We see animalia and protists. So you begin with simplest one, which is protists, then comes fungi, plantae, and animalia. Now, in evolution, we are dealing with a lot of evolution. It was Charles Darwin who conducted evolution on the Galapagos Islands. And we can see there were different species, like sea lions. You won't find these sea lions anywhere but in the Galapagos Island. Where is the Galapagos Island? In Ecuador. And tremendous research in evolution is conducted by evolutionary biologists. And so you have other big, large tortoises or turtles present in the Galapagos Island. I encourage you to go through these videos to get a deeper insight into evolution. And so we see Darwin observed that individuals in a population will differ in their traits. And I talked about it earlier. And more offspring are produced than will survive. And competition is inevitable. So species are going to generally adapt themselves to suit their environment. And he reasoned that those individuals with traits that are able to adapt themselves or suit themselves to the environment are more likely to survive, and therefore we can reproduce. And over time, these individuals in a population are going to develop advantageous traits. And natural environment selects for us developing beneficial traits to survive. And that process Darwin called natural selection. So in the lab, we will be going into detail with scientific method. And the word science, we know, is derived from the Latin word, which means to know. And science is inquiry-based. Inquiry is the search for information and explanation of natural phenomena. And scientists use the process of inquiry, which includes the scientific method. Therefore, what is the scientific method? It is a series of steps that is used to ask a question, or you pose a problem, you make observations, you form a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is an educated guess. Then you test the hypothesis with the help of an experiment. The next step would be you collect the data, you record the data, and you analyze the data. After you collect, record, and analyze the data, you now are going to draw a conclusion as to whether the hypothesis is in accordance with your conclusion. If it is opposite to the conclusion, you repeat the entire experiment. And so, the experiment that you are conducting is always carried out under controlled conditions. So what is the control condition that you have here? In a control, you have two groups. You have a control group and an experimental group. The experimental group has variables. So you can change the features or quantities in an experiment. They are referred to as variables, come from the word vary. A variable, there are two types of variables in an experiment: independent variable and dependent variable. Independent is one that is manipulated by the researchers. So we researchers can change, we can manipulate the variable. So we normally will change temperature, pressure, concentration. The dependent variable is the one that is to be one predicted to be affected by the response. In a controlled experiment, an experimental group, for example, is the non-camouflage mice in this case, is compared with the control group, which is the camouflaged mice. So here we see, talking about science and technology, it has tremendous impacts in our society. For example, our DNA, which is our code of life, it was discovered by two scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick. And they have allowed advances in DNA technology, such as DNA testing, for determining different hereditary diseases like diabetes, hypertension, cancer, breast cancer. They want to detect if you have the presence of the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene. And that's why a doctor will look into your family history. So debates on technology center more on should we do it than can we do it. Now, this was just to end. You see, I don't know, many of you could be are familiar with this researcher or scientist. She is Jane Goodall, who has collected a lot of qualitative data on the behavioral traits of chimpanzees. So she's still conducting research on chimpanzees, the way they behave, how do they interact with human beings and with other animals. And this is the evolutionary based study that she is conducting. So students, I hope you've enjoyed the lecture, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you in the lab on Saturday afternoon in the main campus building, the science department, the 6th floor. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me during the lab. Have a great one, students. Enjoy yourselves. Bye-bye.